Hi everyone! In this video I'm going to talk about troubleshooting tips for brush lettering and dip pen calligraphy. I'll just share some simple tricks you can use to make your lettering as smooth and stress-free as possible. So firstly, think about your paper before you start your project. Or even if you're just having a practice session, do make sure that you're using smooth paper. So this paper here is HP Color Choice card and it's 160 GSM in weight and it's really smooth. It's great for dip pen lettering. It's great for these fine tip brush pens and it also works really well with thicker Tombow brush pens. So by far this is my favorite paper, whether I practice or I need to letter something and then scan it, or maybe I'm doing like a poster design. You can also fold it to the size you need, you can cut it. It's a really good paper. I will add the link for you if you don't have it yet. It's also great if you need to print some guidelines. If you want to print some practice sheets, this is a wonderful paper to go in your printer, and most of the home printers take it very well. If you like having your lettering all at one place, I highly recommend these Rhodia pads. You can get them plain as this, or you can get them dotted as well, with some guidelines there. So it's just a very thin vellum paper here, and again it's really good for dip pens in particular. Any smooth paper should work well, but never ever use copy paper because that's just not going to give you great results. Next, I'll just give you some brush lettering tips. As you might know already, there are different types of pens. So this one here is a Tombow dual brush pen and it's got a very big, sort of a thicker brush, and this Pentel Sign pen has got like a very thin, fine tip, which is great for smaller lettering. And both of these are great. The smaller one is good if you want to letter like place cards, gift tags, and I would keep the bigger ones for sign lettering or poster lettering or like bigger greeting cards. If you want it to look chunky, use this one, or if you're after classic looking and thin lettering, you can go for a fine tip pen. You want to hold your pen correctly because that's going to affect your lettering big time. Common mistake I often see is that my students hold the pen upwards too much. So always make sure that you do have a nice slant, because when you do your downstroke, you can't really achieve a nice thick downstroke when you hold your pen like this and you're going to press down and you're sort of only engaging the tip of the brush. So what you want to do, you want to actually use the side of the brush underneath here. So when you press down and when you have a slant, you're actually using the side of the brush and it's allowing you to achieve a very thick downstroke like this. Another common mistake is to change the position of the hand when you go up. So it's very common to do this. So when you go down, you hold your pen at the slant, and when you want to do an upstroke, you sort of change the position of your hand to this, which again is very sort of upright. And I mean, it works really good for upstrokes, but obviously when we want to do something like this where we transition from thick to thin, we don't want to be changing the position of our hand at all. So we do want it to stay at the slant. So try to just practice doing this. So hold it at a 45-degree slant, do your downstroke, and then practice doing your upstroke by holding the pen at the slant as well, just like this. So this is a really good exercise. You could also use this to warm up your hand before any lettering project you're doing. So the way you hold your pen is a game changer. So by just understanding what this brush can do, the way it can bend and create thickness and thin strokes, should help you to maneuver it correctly. Same thing applies to fine tip pens. Always hold it at the slant. They are a bit smaller, which actually might make your practice a bit easier at first. If you need a bit of inspiration for what pens to use, So I highly recommend these Tombow dual brush pens. And then my second favorites are these Pentel brush sign pens, which come in beautiful colors. And I use these daily. These are just wonderful pens. And I find that they don't run out of ink too quickly either. And my third favorite at the moment are these Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens. So again, they come in different colors and they have a lovely fine tip, which just looks really beautiful. And it kind of got that watercolor look. So my stroke isn't very even in color. So I have a bit of darkness there and it gets a bit lighter. So I do like that. I will add links for you for these. And next, let's talk about dip pen lettering. So I have my oblique pen holder here. So it's got like a little flange to the side. You can also get straight pen holders. I don't really like straight pen holders personally. I started to learn calligraphy with one, which was wonderful, but I quickly transitioned to this. And it just makes lettering at the slant a bit easier, and I just find that it's easier to hold for me personally. So if you've only tried one type, I highly recommend trying both, straight and obliques. And there's actually a pen holder designed for this. So there are these oblique pen holders, they're called, and you can use it as an oblique, and you can take it out and then insert your nib in here and use it as a straight pen holder. I mainly use these day to day, or these speedball oblique pen holders. And if you're left-handed, definitely go for a straight pen holder because the flange is going to be the wrong side for you. So let's talk about ink. So again, the way your lettering flows and the way it looks is going to depend on materials you use mainly. So remember, you want to have smooth paper, you want to have a nice quality nib. So this is a Nikko G nib. You want to have a pen holder you're fully comfortable with. And when it comes to ink, you want to have a good quality ink. And it might be tricky finding paper and ink combination. But again, HB Color Choice card I mentioned before seems to work with most of the inks I've tried in my 7-year lettering journey. So I highly recommend it. Before you start lettering, always shake your ink and just notice whether your ink is thick or is it thin. Sometimes when you're lettering for hours and you leave your little jar uncapped like this, the water tends to evaporate, which means that you're left with a very, very thick ink. And it will happen to everybody after a while. Let's say if you've been using your ink for a month or so, it might have thickened up slightly and it's just going to make your lettering flow very difficult because the ink is too thick to flow through your nib properly. So what I highly recommend in that case is just adding a few drops of water to your ink, literally just 4 or 5 drops. You can use one of those pipettes, or you can get a spray bottle and just spray a bit in there, which I'm just going to do now because my ink is always too thick. I always leave it out like this, which isn't great. So I do tend to add a bit of water every other day. And then you can always stir your ink with the other side of your pen holder, give it a good stir. And then testing. So do test your ink before you start any project. So just do a couple of downstrokes, notice the way it flows. If you're sort of running out of ink very quickly, or if your ink doesn't really flow very well, it means that it might be too thick. And then do a couple of upstrokes. Notice how your ink is behaving here. Again, if it's hard to do upstrokes, and you might notice that your ink is just sort of stuck in here, that might also mean that it's too thick. So diluting with water is very, very helpful. And if you notice that your ink is too runny, which is also something we don't really want, you can always thicken it up by adding a few drops of gum arabic. So this is great. It makes your lettering a bit more glossy, going to make its texture a bit nicer. Again, 2 or 3 drops should do the trick. You can always add a bit and then test and add more if you need to. I add this to all of my hand mixed inks, and it makes the coloured inks especially a bit brighter, I find. So yeah, this is a lifesaver, really, really important to have for any calligrapher. So let's say you've tested your ink and it seems fine, but it still doesn't really flow the way you want it to. This could also be because your nibs are brand new. And if they're brand new, they do need to be treated. So sometimes that needs to be done more than once. So if you've been lettering for a while, you might already know that when you get a brand new nib, it comes with an oily manufacturer coating on it and it needs treating before you actually start dipping it into ink. And you can do a few things. You can stick it in a potato for a few minutes, very gently, very carefully, and then rinse it with water. Or you can use nail polish and very gently clean it off. You can also use just washing up liquid with some water and just rinse them under a tap. Whatever you do, remember that you might need to do this more than once. So if you've treated your nib and it's brand new and it still doesn't flow, it will either take a bit of time for it to work properly, or you might need to treat it once again. So that's something to bear in mind. Never, ever, ever use a brand new nib out of packet straight with your ink. And when you've treated your nib, try not to handle it with fingers too much, because our fingers have natural oils in them, and also those can be transferred onto your nib, which is going to affect your ink flow. Another thing I highly recommend is having some paper tissue next to you when you're doing nib calligraphy in particular, because very often you'll find that your nib catches dirt or maybe some dust or paper fibers, and this is especially true if you're using cotton paper. So obviously if you're lettering on a textured surface like this, you might need to wipe your nib with a tissue after every single place card, just to make sure that your upstrokes are nice and crisp. Once your ink is sorted, once your nib is sorted, and once you have your paper ready to go, next thing, we just want to make sure that we're holding this pen correctly. You want to place your index finger here, sort of follow the length of this pen holder, and then grip your pen from the sides with your middle finger and thumb like this. Then rest your wrist sort of kind of flat, but slightly rotated to the right. Rest your hand, rest your elbow, and point your nib down. So it should be facing straight down like this. So it's not sort of leaning to one side or another. It's pointing down, and sometimes just practicing without any ink, just sort of practicing these gliding movements. So we're gliding our hand down and up. Notice how, again, I'm not adjusting the position of my hand. I'm keeping the same for downstrokes and upstrokes. You can try some circles as well. This is a perfect warm-up, especially if you're struggling with lettering flow and if you're finding it hard to relax your hand whilst you're lettering. Doing these exercises are really, really helpful. Lastly, when you're practicing, I highly, highly recommend using guidelines. I've designed this sheet, which I'll upload to this post. So you can print this as many times as you like, and you can practice lettering words using these guidelines. And I thought we can just do a few words so I can explain what these lines actually mean. So I'm just going to use my fine tip brush pen here. You can use any pen to practice on these. So this third line from the top acts as a baseline. So this is where all of the X height letters would go. So the X height is this. So usually letters like A, so lowercase a or lowercase c, or lowercase e. So they would all sort of fit within these two lines. So they're sort of smaller. But what happens when we have letters that are sort of a bit longer? For example, the letter L, the letter K, What's another example? The letter D, for example. So basically all of the letters that sort of stretch up, which are usually higher up like here. So these are called ascender letters. This top line is an ascender line. So let's just name this so it's clear. And sometimes your letters will stretch down. So for example, letters like G or J or Q. These are called descender letters. So this is a descender line here at the bottom. So baseline, ascender line and descender line. So these are just the proportions you probably want to follow when you're doing calligraphy. Although, because we are most of the time relaxing these rules a little bit and we're doing bouncy lettering quite often, you can also bounce these letters, especially these ones in the middle. You can make them higher up or lower down. I wouldn't play as much with these ascender or descender letters. So I would always make sure that ascender one is touching the top line and the descender one is touching the bottom line of these guidelines. So let's just letter a few words together so it's nice and clear. So let's just do something simple like hello summer, for example. So I'm starting with the letter H. So this is my ascender letter. So you can see it's touching the top line. But because it's also a very bouncy letter, I'm sort of bouncing it down to the bottom line. So that's quite interesting to notice. Then we have the letter L, which is also touching the top line. And then the letter O nicely fits within these two lines in the middle. I like to do my letter S quite big, so I'm going to stretch it quite a lot here. And then I'm fitting the smaller letters like U and M on this baseline, but I'm going to bounce the letter M. It's a very common letter to bounce, and yeah, it just looks really nice. When you stretch this last downstroke down a little bit. And then I'm going to position the letter R a little bit higher, just to create a lovely bounce here as well. This is a good example. Let's do another word. Let's do the word sunshine. Again, I like to have my letters S fairly big. And then I'm starting to fit these smaller letters between these two lines in the middle, bouncing the letter N a little bit. And then I'm stretching up for the letter H, bouncing it down again. There we go. So I highly recommend using these guidelines when you're practicing. It will make so much easier to do freehand lettering. I often hear from my students that they sort of panic when they see a blank page and they don't really know how high their letters should be, how big, or where to position them on the page. So I often say just draw some guidelines and try to follow this technique. Once you practice a little bit, it will just get so much more natural for you doing it freehand. So these are all the tips I wanted to share with you today. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed watching this. Happy lettering and I'll see you next time.